Okay, everyone, we will get started here in a few minutes. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalie James, and I'm the Coalition Builder for Prosperity Indiana, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. It is a pleasure to have you to participate on today's webinar, Evicted in Indiana, Part 1, Indiana's Rental Housing Eviction Landscape. This webinar is sponsored by the Indianapolis Foundation, an affiliate of the Central Indiana Community Foundation, through a grant from the foundation focused on expanding affordable housing resources for the lowest income. This webinar is also sponsored by the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. The Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition was formed by members of Indiana's housing security advocacy community in April 2020 to support advocacy and education related to housing and homelessness prevention in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Staffed by Prosperity Indiana through advocacy and coalition building grants from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the Central Indiana Community Foundation, HHNC convenes partners from across Indiana to advocate for immediate, medium, and long-term housing stability policy solutions and conduct education and research to achieve federal, state, and local policies for an equitable response and recovery to the pandemic and beyond. In 2016, Eviction Lab published a list ranking Indianapolis as the city with the second highest number of evictions in the nation, second only to New York City. In addition to Indianapolis, Fort Wayne and South Bend also made it onto the list. Despite a number of larger cities in Indiana ending up on the list, many of Indiana's smaller cities and rural areas actually have even higher rates of evictions. So this is truly a statewide problem that undercuts housing stability and the economy in communities across Indiana. Today, we will hear from a number of local experts about the toll that eviction has taken on Indiana. Towards the end, we will have the opportunity for Q&A. Before I turn over the webinar to Prosperity Indiana's Executive Director, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. Please be aware that all audio is muted. If you would like to ask a question, there are two ways to do so. You can use the raise hand icon on your screen. We will mute your line and you may ask, we will unmute your line, and you may ask your question or questions. You can always type your question or questions in the Q&A box, which is also located on your screen. We all know that technology can be trying these days, especially while working from home. So if you lose your connection, you may also reconnect using the link emailed to you. Finally, after today's webinar, you can find both the presentation and recording available on the housingforhoosiers.org under the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition section. And now, I will introduce our guest for today. Dr. Bianca Merritt, PhD, is a clinical assistant professor at IUPUI and founding director of the Center for Research on Inclusion Policy, or CRISP. Bianca Merritt is founding director of the Center for Research on Inclusion and Social Policy at the Indiana University Public Policy Institute and clinical assistant professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Her work at CRISP involves working with a multidisciplinary team of analysts and students to understand the intersection of public policy and equity in Indianapolis in areas such as poverty reduction, housing, public safety, and human service provision, among others. She is a board member of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, Thomas Gregg Neighborhood School, and is a member of the Indianapolis Continuum of Care Blueprint Council. Dr. Merritt has a PhD in Health Promotion Sciences from the Hudson College of Public Health at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center and her master's in political science from Texas A&M University. Dr. Merritt is joined today by Kelsey Stringham Marquis, and a research coordinator for the Center of Research on Inclusion and Social Policy. Kelsey's research focuses on projects focused on housing, homelessness, and human services. Her work includes analyzing and helping to conduct the annual point-in-time count, evaluating human services programs, and understanding the factors related. Kelsey has 10 years of experience engaging in direct service, supervisory roles with nonprofits, and data analysis related to homelessness. Additionally, she has experience in and works on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Merritt and Kelsey.
All right, thanks everyone. I am trying to share my screen. Okay, I think that should be it. Can you see it, Natalie?
Yes, we're good to go.
Awesome. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Natalie. I'm presenting along with my colleague, Kelsey Stringham Marquis, just giving an overview of eviction and housing stability before jumping into some of my other colleagues who can talk a lot more about kind of the on-the-ground experiences related to eviction. So I wanted to start by just quickly defining what eviction is. Natalie gave us some good background on, some of the trends that are happening across the state. There's a lot of national discussion around eviction. And so just to be clear about what we're talking about, I think throughout this webinar, is eviction is a landlord-initiated decision to force a tenant out of a rental property. And so usually this is something that should go to court. That is what we call a formal eviction, where there's an actual process, legal process that takes place. But often evictions don't actually go to court, and we call those informal or constructive evictions, during which a person might actually be, it might be used as a threat to get someone to pay their rent. It doesn't necessarily materialize in something, but it can create all kinds of problems because the person might not know that something's not actually on their record, and it's technically not a good thing to do from a landlord perspective, but it happens more often than not. And so some of the numbers that Natalie shared with you could actually be an undercount, because so many of these informal evictions go under the radar and are actually on the docket, that there could be more than what we see actually going to court. And the most common reason for evictions to happen is non-payment of rent, which is a totally legal thing to happen, but there are a lot of complicated reasons for that. So when we talk about housing and housing instability, one thing that's really important is that eviction does not occur in a vacuum. And I think a lot of discussions that have taken place, especially across Indiana, have unnecessarily focused on, just eviction itself and not many of the root causes. And so Kelsey helped kind of develop this framework to think about eviction and housing instability broadly. And so when we think about it, it really kind of operates on this continuum of, we think about folks, as we talked about before, we really do a lot of work across the spectrum of housing instability, including kind of chronic abject homelessness. And there are a lot of factors that lead that to happen. I think often when we talk about eviction currently, there's a lot of push toward, oh my gosh, these people are going to be completely homeless, but there's so many things that happen in advance of that. And so we think of that as kind of primary preventive efforts. This is really reducing homelessness through more protective factors, environmental factors that happen way before someone experiences an eviction, and that's really common to housing instability. So one thing that we like to think about here is predictors of housing instability. So this is a really not straightforward process that leads people into experiencing evictions. It's, it can be cyclical. There can be lots of causes that we'll talk a little bit more about. But, just as an example that we like to give, you can see this graphic on the right talks about how someone could be experiencing mental illness. We know a lot of folks now are even experiencing severe mental illness or even depression, particularly depression as a result of, COVID-19 and other factors. And so, those things can lead a person to not be able to work and be unemployed, which can lead to them not having income. They don't pay their rent, they get evicted, and they could end up being homeless. So that's one of many, many examples of how a person could end up being housing unstable and being evicted. And then another thing to consider, of course, that we'll talk about in a little bit, is the role of equity, racial equity, and other types of social equity dimensions. That it doesn't just happen kind of, sporadically. There really is a systemic way in which evictions take place. So one example and one main cause of eviction is policy issues and legislative decisions. We have federal and state fair housing policies that are supposed to protect certain classes from experiencing discrimination in housing. Unfortunately, it is not always super protective. Housing policies at all levels of government have a very strong history of racism, and particularly anti-Black racism in them, which kind of helps facilitate negative outcomes, even if it's not explicitly stated. There are some groups that have that lack certain discrimination protections, especially when we look at the state and local levels. So, race is usually a factor, but sometimes it's not. National origin is not always a factor. Sexual orientation is not always a factor. So there are lots of things that might create an environment in which evictions can happen more easily, including the fact that we see differences at the local versus state levels and, the different types of protections that exist. So on the left, you see this map of the US. It tells us different types of tenant protections. The orangey states are pro-business, meaning they tend to be pro-landlord. The pink ones are contradictory, which means they have some protections and some penalties for tenants. And protectionist policies in blue mean that the state has really tenant-friendly environments. And so you can see Indiana falls into the orangey landlord-friendly state category because we really don't have a lot of tenant protection. So that is really kind of the primary facilitator for why a lot of these other factors can happen with evictions. Other things include lack of affordable housing supply. So if a person is saying, can I afford to live here? HUD, Housing and Urban Development, defines housing that costs no more than 30% of a household's income as being affordable. You can ask yourself whether you think that is a good threshold, but this, varies by city and state in terms of what that actual number looks like. So you can see for the state of Indiana, median household income is substantially higher than it is for Marion County. And then when we look at that for renters, it's even lower for both locations. And so when we think about, can people afford to live at a certain place, that's one question. Now, the other issue is, of course, that we don't have a supply there. So we actually have a pretty strong lack of support for housing supply, including from private developers, and nearly half of Hoosiers pay more than 30% of their income on rent. So we have high rent burdens, which leads to housing instability, and we have not a lot of investment in affordable housing to support the incomes that you see here. There are also disparities by race and ethnicity across different populations as it relates to, again, ability to afford, with people of color being less likely to afford not just affordable housing, but quality affordable housing. Another issue includes administrative burdens and wraparound supports. Accessing housing supports can be very complicated, especially for those who are most vulnerable. So very few individuals actually receive housing assistance. When we talk about, can you afford to live here? Oh, you need some financial support. We don't actually see a lot of folks successfully being able to obtain housing assistance. There are certainly some programs through the CARES Act lately that have attempted to increase the amount of rental support, but historically it has been a burden for folks to access. They have to navigate different support networks and local policies and procedures to be able to actually meaningfully get support through nonprofits and other organizations to get financial support. Some other factors that are important include the role of credit history in renting. So it's kind of a bi-directional relationship where we see folks who have bad credit scores not being able to rent, but then also, you know, if you're renting and particularly if you get evicted, it can affect your credit history, which makes it really difficult for you to rent again. So we definitely see some of those trends. We also see underemployment. I talked about income, but you know, being able to not just be employed, but be underemployed in terms of, you know, not being able to have employment that provides you with sufficient income, and then also kind of being overemployed in the sense that people are often working multiple jobs to be able to afford to rent. And again, rental costs and housing costs tend to be the biggest you know, financial burden for folks. And so being able to afford rent is a huge burden, and many people are working multiple jobs just to be able to have a place to live. Households with children, and Kelsey, feel free to jump in here. We know that households with kids are more likely to be evicted nationally. And so we can see those trends play out as well, because again, you have multiple folks in a household. It makes it difficult for you know, landlords to justify renting to them, because obviously kids can, you know, kind of obviously tear things up, make things a little messy, and so landlords tend to not like to rent to folks with kids. Kelsey, I didn't know if you had anything to add there. If not, that's cool. Disabilities are also an issue. Again, they're typically fair housing protections for folks with disabilities, but we also see there are a wide range of different types of disabilities. And so while there might be physical accommodations, there might not be accommodations for folks with mental health issues or other factors. And so they could be discriminated against in that way, both in terms of renting as well as being evicted. And then lastly, criminal history, which is a major issue. Folks who might be evicted based on that. Again, they also are difficult to rent to, because landlords can discriminate and say, you know, if you have a criminal history, you might lead to, you know, you might make our property unsafe, so we don't want to rent to you. There's also the issues if you have a criminal history and you have been recently incarcerated, you don't have sufficient income to afford a place to stay. And so even if you do get that income, they might ask you to, you know, have a certain month's rent. If at any point you lose your job, which can also be lost due to criminal history and discrimination there, then again, you don't have income. And so again, some of these factors that are very much interrelated and make it a lot easier for folks to create an environment of housing instability that lead to eviction. And
Hey, Bianca.
lastly, individuals with a prior eviction are more likely to be evicted or prevented from renting a unit. They're also more likely to be Black or Latinx. And so if we look at this graph, you can see that Indiana has the highest eviction rate compared to our neighbors in the Midwest. I included Kentucky in there as well. And again, so if we're already living in a place that has high eviction rates and folks of color more likely to be evicted, we're setting up this cycle very early as a means to kind of keep that relationship going. And so some other considerations that are important are the fact that we can't fully address eviction without addressing numerous primary prevention issues. So a lot of the things that I talked about before really establish this environment of housing instability that lead to an easier way for folks to be evicted. There is a persistence of racial disparity in eviction and prevention areas. Even thinking about criminal history, people of color are overrepresented there. And so when we think about these areas of housing instability that are incredibly problematic, again, they tend to disproportionately affect people of color. There's a need for better data access and linkage, especially in Indiana. There are other cities and states that do a much better job than we do of being able to make the connection between evictions and other, you know, these major housing instability related outcomes and issues. And we just don't have that here in the state or in Indianapolis and Marion County, where most of us on this call are. And so as a result, it's really important to build on existing partnerships, collaboration. Some of the folks on this call and this webinar have great expertise so that folks aren't reinventing the wheel, but really kind of, again, making those connections to, you know, reduce the role of these housing unstable environments across the state and in cities within the state. So that's it. And with that, I will pass it back to Natalie, and we look forward to your questions moving forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Merritt, for all that useful information. As we know, Indiana is, you know, we have a really big eviction problem, basically. And so now we'll hear from sort of the human point of view with Mike Chaperon, who is the Executive Director of Family Promise of Greater Indianapolis, and he has been since 2016. Family Promise is a partnership of congregations and community organizations responding to the crisis of children and their families who are homeless. The team works to eliminate homelessness in Greater Indianapolis. And Mike's previous experience as a case manager, community organizer, and fundraiser with various organizations for the past 15 years. He holds a master's degree in public affairs and nonprofit management from Indiana University, and he lives in Indianapolis with his wife and two children. Mike is joined today by Erin Mathis, who will be interviewed about her experience with eviction and eventual success finding housing. Mike?
Mike, you'll need to take yourself off of mute, please. Natalie, maybe we could come back to Mike if he is having issues connecting.
Okay, that sounds good. We can go on to our next presenter, who is Brandon Beeler, who's the director of the Indiana Housing Center at Indiana Legal Services, where he represents low-income clients in rental housing matters, as well as identifies and litigates statewide systemic issues related to Hoosier tenants. Mr. Beeler began his advocacy for low-income tenants by being selected to work as a part of a grant funded by Equal Justice Works in AmeriCorps as Tenant Engagement and Community Economic Development Legal Fellow, where he worked with public housing tenants in projects undergoing the Rental Assistance Demonstration RAD conversion. Prior to joining ILS, Mr. Beeler served as a law clerk for the Honorable Richard L. Young in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Indiana. Indiana Legal Services is a not-for-profit law firm and the largest provider of free civil legal assistance to eligible low-income people throughout the state of Indiana. ILS helps clients who are faced with legal problems that harm their ability to have such basics as food, shelter, income, medical care, or personal safety. Most of the cases Indiana Legal Services handles are cases such as family law, where there is domestic violence, housing, consumer law, access to health care, and access to government benefits issues. Welcome, Brandon.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. And do I have control of, oh, I do. 1 second. All right, are we seeing the screen?
Yes, we are, Brandon. Thank you.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me to Prosperity Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition and all these great presenters. I'm going to here kind of talk about from the legal standpoint of what we see for regarding eviction throughout the state. So really quickly, the overview of what I'll talk today is, again, this a little bit about the state of evictions in Indiana, which really only supplements the great information that Dr. Merritt provided. And then, you know, I have to use this opportunity to just sort of discuss and point out a few things that are going on now and some protections and resources that are available to tenants, because I can just say from my experience and from our experience at Legal Services, especially since COVID really got, really started to affect our state in mid-March, probably the biggest issue, the biggest thing we see are just questions about what's going on, what's my rights, where can I find help? So it's not always necessarily legal help, but I certainly want to use this opportunity to make sure anyone on the call who may be currently personally affected by this, or work with groups or work with people who are dealing with eviction or concerned about eviction in the middle of this pandemic, so folks know where to go. So really quickly, thank you, Natalie. Natalie did a great job explaining what Indiana Legal Services is. We are a statewide not-for-profit law firm. We do civil law. We don't do anything criminal. And we really just focus in on the basic needs of Hoosiers. So housing, domestic violence, our family law with domestic violence, benefits. We do some immigration and things like that. So prior to COVID-19, and again, this is really just going to kind of summarize or briefly comment again on what Dr. Merritt just presented, but Indiana was already in an eviction crisis prior to COVID-19 hitting us. We had a few cities making the top 5 or 10 nationally as the worst eviction rates. As Natalie said in the very beginning, Indianapolis is at the top 2 of metropolitan areas throughout the country of the highest and worst eviction rates. And Fort Wayne has made that list, has made the top 10 as well. It is, as we can expect, it's getting worse during COVID. Some of the predictors, there are a lot of models out there, and the one that I've sort of looked at and I've relied on is this Stout eviction predictor. And at this point, just to kind of give you an idea of where we are in this state, is that the evicted number of households that are, the estimated number of households that are going to be unable to pay rent and that are at risk for eviction throughout the entire state is 313,000. What that amounts to is about 42% of all Indiana renters are unable to pay their rent and could be facing eviction either currently or after this moratorium ends on December 31st. The estimated eviction filings over the next 4 months is about 211,000. So that's pretty high numbers. And again, if we're thinking nearly half of Indiana renters are going to face eviction here coming up in the next few months or after December 31st, we certainly do have a even bigger crisis on our hands. What ILS has seen, again, since we sort of have shut down beginning in mid-March, we've seen a steady increase of applications for legal assistance related to evictions and rental housing issues. But I just pulled the numbers. I tried to do this on Monday. It's been steady over the past 4 weeks. We have received over triple the amount of assistance that our request for assistance than our office has ever received. So that being said, of course, we have worked really hard, and when we get to the resources section, you'll see some resources that we've helped develop, as well as other community groups have helped develop to help renters. But that demand for assistance isn't going down, and we are a nonprofit, so we do not have, we have certainly a capacity issue that we are starting to face now. So, the consequences for eviction. Again, I was really impressed with Dr. Merritt's data and research, and this is just sort of a more conversational way to approach it. So, of course, the first one is this housing instability. And something that folks are always really interested to learn about, or surprised to learn about, I should say, is that the simple filing, or I shouldn't even say simple, I used to say simple, but the filing of an eviction action can have devastating consequences. And that's even an eviction action that maybe doesn't have a merit. Maybe the landlord is frustrated and didn't follow, wasn't ready to file for eviction, or wasn't ripe for an eviction yet, or the tenant hadn't breached the lease yet, but the landlord simply moved on and filed. Even a frivolous filing shows up in a public record and can seriously harm the tenant from being able to secure affordable housing in the future. As discussed by Dr. Merritt, we do have an affordable housing crisis as well, our supply crisis as well here in Indiana too. So getting evicted can really, really cause a huge cycle of homelessness and and other dangerous consequences. I can give an example of something that happens pretty regularly in my practice personally. Is even in cases where the tenant wins and the judgment is in favor of the tenant and an eviction is not given to the landlord in a case, I can count at least in my experience over 30 clients I've either written letters for, or I've had to years later call future landlords and housing providers, some in this state, some in other states, to try to explain to them that yes, I understand this filing showed up on your search and your background search of this tenant. However, if you look closely, you'll see that they won the case and the case was dismissed in their favor or whatever. So and I get this from landlords a lot in my work is, well, we're just going to file, we'll see where it goes, we have no problem negotiating. But that act of filing is an affirmative act that starts the process of really harming vulnerable and especially low income Hoosiers. excuse me, going forward, and then there are health consequences, and this is really starting to get studied a lot more closely, even on the national scale, but within our office as well. I mean, I shouldn't say obviously, but thinking about what we all go through, and if we have, even if for us who are fortunate to have housing stability, just think of the impacts that COVID has had on our lives and our families, and imagine complicating that on worrying about whether the roof over your head. Again, I think there's a comedian out there that makes a joke about, oh, it's so, we complain about having, being stuck in our homes, but imagine, not having that, not having a home to be stuck in and to protect yourself during this. So, there really are some health consequences that are just that get worse by eviction, let alone, and that won't even get into the point of like habitability issues and other things that we see renters deal with when it comes to health issues. Debt and financial burdens. The way eviction works in Indiana, very simply, is it's a two-part process. And so there are two separate hearings. The first hearing, which happens pretty quickly, is what we all kind of think of as eviction. It's the possession hearing. Who gets possession? Does the landlord get possession back, or does possession remain with the tenant? But then usually after that hearing, about 3 months later, is a damages hearing. And at that point, and a lot of times even tenants themselves who may have notice of this hearing, it's been so long, it's their old landlord, sometimes can be filed up to 6 months to a year later, gets a judgment against them, and that can be attached to their, to wages and other things. And so, this is a financial problem and a debt that can stay with the tenant forever, and tenants may not have the resources or ability to defend against what the landlord seeks as far as money damages. And of course, this all continues to exacerbate and make our homelessness issue and our homelessness crisis worse. And again, I fear for what happens without more guardrails coming into place. So I want to take this opportunity to sort of briefly talk about the CDC eviction moratorium. This is the one that anyone who's on this call, I'm going to guess, has at least heard of it because it has made a lot of news. And I just want to make sure that folks understand what it is and what protections are under it. So first, it was published, which that's how the CDC made it into a federal policy. It was on September 4th. And it was issued under the CDC's authority to take actions to prevent the spread of infectious and communicable disease. It extends through the end of the year. So you'll see why in a few minutes I put these active dates. So we just, we have to work within that time frame. But here are the active dates for the CDC's eviction moratorium. It applies into every U.S. state and territory with reported cases of COVID-19 and that don't already have an eviction moratorium in place, or an eviction moratorium with the same, with at least the minimum protections of the CDC moratorium. So Indiana qualifies. So what does it do? It prevents the evictions of covered persons for non-payment of rent. And that's a fun legal term. So what is covered persons? Actually, it's very simple. It's simply a tenant who provides a written tenant declaration that's sworn under penalty of perjury to the landlord. So what do you see there? And where we're seeing some big problems and some big issues, it is the tenant's duty to provide this declaration. The landlord has no obligation to tell the tenant about this program, and unfortunately, courts also don't have an affirmative duty to tell tenants that this exists. So it is something that the tenant has to be aware that this protection is out there, and in order to receive the protection, they must find a tenant declaration and provide it. And this covers both private landlords, private agreements and apartment complexes, and also those who are in federally subsidized housing programs, such as the Section 8 voucher program. Quickly going further, so again, it does permit, and there's some guidance, and I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts in this, and won't get too legalese on everyone, but basically it does permit eviction for other material lease violations, just not for non-payment. There are some prerequisites that are contained within the declaration, but the one I'm just going to point out here is that there is an income qualification. So those are the three categories, and please note that it's an or, they're not an and. So either the tenant does not expect to earn $99,000 this year, the tenant was not required to report income last year, or the tenant received a stimulus check. If any of those are applicable, the tenant qualifies under the eligibility portion of the CDC moratorium. And again, it prevents evictions for the covered persons. And the Department of Justice is actually, there are criminal penalties attached with this. They're enforced by the DOJ, so we don't really have control over them. But if, from our position as a, a tenant advocate, if we hear a landlord's doing something, we would maybe try to informally inform them or notify the local DOJ, but we don't have too much control over that. That's sort of an administration's decision. So to the big point that I wanted to kind of leave everyone with, and I'm certainly available to email these out and if these slides are, and I'll hopefully make these slides available, but let me just quickly start with the resources we have out there, or not we, but that are out there. So first and foremost, rental assistance. From my standpoint, this is one of the most important things that the state and cities can offer to tenants, because none of the moratoria that have come out have have waived the tenant's duty to pay rent. So even if a tenant cannot be evicted, the rent bills are continuing to pile up, and the CDC moratorium does not prevent landlords from assessing late fees. And for those who are renters or have been renters, you may have seen in some of your leases there are some seriously accelerated late fee payments. So those are still inactive. Those are still active too. So there could be some pretty big bills due at the end of the year for tenants that they may just not be able to get out of. So these rental assistance programs, I think, are really important, and I hope they continue to get funded. I actually hope there are more. But what do we have now? We do have a statewide rental assistance program, except for Marion County, and we'll see why in one more bullet point. But that's administered through IHCDA. This is the website. So if you're a tenant or know a tenant not in Marion County who may want to see if they qualify for rental assistance, there's the website. It's indianahousingnow.org. In Marion County, Marion County has its own rental assistance program. So that is at indyrent.org. And if for some reason tenants don't qualify, or if landlords don't want to accept the rental assistance from these programs, we in our office are trying by county to collect these. It's just really, frankly, a grassroots campaign of just calling different organizations. But I'd suggest on your own, or suggesting tenants to look at community groups or nonprofits. Some of them have set up rental assistance accounts on their own just through donations from their supporters and members. Faith groups have been really strong in this. Churches, mosques, synagogues have been really great about stepping up for the community, and have not really required that people who receive the rental assistance from them even be a member or a congregant. It's really to help the community. And also I put that on there with some resistance, but just to be clear, you always want to check and see if your township trustee will be willing to help. But that's just, again, for completion. We haven't had a lot of luck with that. So here are some programs available. In Marion County, we have a program that's our office is administering, called the TLAP, Tenant Legal Assistance Program. The big takeaway here is that if you live in Marion County, there's no income requirement. You don't have to be of our income requirements, which is the lowest levels of poverty. Every Thursday from 11 to 1, there's the number. Any tenant can call. You don't have to have a case filed. You can just have a simple question about evictions, about your housing or your rental conditions, whatever it is. Call that number and you will speak with a live attorney and get some legal information right away. In addition, every day, there is a tenant information hotline. This is not staffed by attorneys. This is just some simple information, but it also is our feeder to our two of the programs we have in our office that are specific to eviction. Again, the TLAP program and our eviction avoidance project. Again, there's no income requirement to call that number and get some basic information. So those are two resources for Marion County. In Allen County, anyone from Fort Wayne, the city of Fort Wayne and our office has created the Fort Wayne Tenant Assistance Legal Clinic. I believe they're working towards having a weekly hotline as well, but at this point, that's the number to call if you want information about what that program might be able to do for you. I put this one on there because it temporarily is offline right now, but I think it's going to come back on very soon, and possibly November 1. So I just want to tell folks to keep an eye out. If you're in the New Albany area, so Clark and Floyd counties, there was a weekly tenant hotline, but again, it should come back on soon. Finally, the Indiana Landlord Tenant the Indiana Supreme Court commissioned a Landlord Tenant Task Force. If you go to the Indiana Court site, you will see under their COVID-19 resources page. This is just a place to check regularly. We try to write it. It was written to be for the layperson to read. It's not written just for lawyers or judges. So it's just information about what the state courts, their view of what the moratorium and the moratorium protect. There are also sample forms and resources for tenants. That CDC declaration form is available there, but I also want to kind of introduce this new tool created by our partners and our friends over at Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic and the City of Indy. This just launched on Friday, so if you go to indyrenterhelp.org, there is a great online tool to create your own CDC declaration form. It makes it downloadable. I think you can even through the website email it to your landlord. So I want to make sure everyone's aware about that because I want to help promote that this week, because this is a lot of work done by those two groups, and I think it's a great thing for all. And just because it's City of Indy, it can be used statewide. It's a statewide tool. Finally, I'm going to kind of just mention this Landlord and Tenant Settlement Conference program. This is another part of Landlord Tenant Task Force. This is something that does not require a case, but it's basically a mediation. If landlords and tenants are, you think eviction might be coming, or you're concerned, you don't need to have a case filed, but if you want to try to get ahead of it and try to resolve any sort of issue a tenant has with their landlords, or vice versa, landlords can request it too. It's a free service, but both parties do have to agree to participate. And those are kind of the balance of interest in deciding whether to participate or not. I really want to go back to that first point we said about the filing of an eviction being a cause that can really, dramatically hurt an individual's ability to keep affordable housing and stay housed. That's the balance here. If the tenant they're falling behind and, no case has been filed, so they can prevent that case filing, that might be a good position for the tenant to try to get into this program to work out a repayment plan with their landlord. And there's that website at the bottom. It's just courts.in.gov/facilitate, and you can find information about that program. Finally, I just put that's our intake numbers. We have a live intake on the phone Monday through Friday from 10 to 2 Eastern. You can also go to indianalegalservices.org. Our website also does have a number of COVID-19 resources for housing and eviction, but also for all areas, unemployment insurance, domestic violence, divorce, things like that. So I would check out our website for a more broad sense of legal resources. Of course, Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic, local legal aid providers such as Indianapolis Legal Aid Society. And I'd also look to bar associations for their lawyer referral services, but also a lot of bar associations are starting to host more Ask a Lawyer virtual hotlines where you can actually, again, speak to a lawyer. I think they're all being trained in landlord-tenant areas because, of course, that's a big need and concern. So just check your local community or your county's bar and see if they're going to have a Ask a Lawyer event, and that's a great resource as well. That's all I have. If you want these resources or need have any other questions for me that aren't addressed today, please feel free to email me anytime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was such great information. And all these slides will be available after the webinar so that you all have access to Brandon's contact information. And now we will hear from Mike Chaperon, who is the Executive Director at Family Promise of Greater Indianapolis. And Mike will be joined by Erin Mathis, who will be interviewed about her experience with eviction and eventual success finding housing. Mike.
All right, thanks everybody, and thanks for your patience through our internet issues that we had a little bit earlier. I wanted to tell a joke like, oh, I got here late because I went to a party last night or something, but I figured most of you don't know me or Erin, so you might not get the sarcasm of it, but we're glad to pull up the tail end of this presentation before the Q&A. So I'm Mike Chaperon from Family Promise of Greater Indy. We're a shelter, and I'm with?
My name is Erin Mathis.
Erin Mathis, who has been through our shelter program and is now housed and has been housed with her 3 beautiful daughters for a couple of years now, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Our goal in this 10 minutes or less is to kind of let you know the human side of what goes on in a family's life when they have to go through an eviction. And Erin is brave enough to share some of her story with us today. I wanted to start with a little anecdote from the social service perspective. And I know some of you listening, like Joe, Wilbur, and Carolyn, have heard this story a few times, but for many of you, it may be new. So I've been here about 4.5 years at Family Promise. And I remember my first day on the job was May of, 2016 at this point. And I was answering the phones in the morning because I wanted to get a feel for who was calling in. And around 8:30, 9 a.m., somewhere around there, the first phone rang. And I answered, I said, this is Family Promise. How can we help you? And they said, do you have any space in your shelter for me and my kids? I said, oh, no, I'm sorry. We're actually full right now. You could try 211. That's a phone number you can call for social services to find out what other shelters might be out there have a spot. They said, okay, thanks. Not 30 seconds later, it rang again. Same line, Family Promise, how can we help you? Do you have space for me and my son? No, I'm sorry, we're full, but you could try 211. Okay, thanks. It rang about 3 or 4 more times in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Same exact script, having to turn families away because our shelter, who serves 8 families at a time back then anyway, was full. And then it rang, and it was a call that still stayed with me, and I still think about it at least every week. It was a young female voice, and she said, do you have space today? I said, no, I'm sorry, we don't. You could call 211 for other. I've called 211. I've called Dayspring. I've called Holy Family. I've been calling all of you for 2 weeks now. When will you have a spot? I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't know. I'm sleeping in the attic of my brother's house. Do you know how hot it gets in an attic? I have an infant baby. Do you know how hot it gets? Now, this was a late day in May, and it was like 85 degrees the day before. So, I mean, I've been in an attic. I haven't had to sleep in one, thank God. But yeah, I can't imagine how hot it gets. So I said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you could try us at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We may have a click. And she hung up. So I don't know for a fact anything about that mom, but I'd be willing to bet that she had gone through an eviction, maybe more than one, in our city of Indianapolis. Because most of the families we serve, I'd say 90% of the families we serve, are having to call a shelter because after getting an eviction on their record, they're having a really hard time getting back on their feet, despite the fact that more than 2/3 of the families in our shelter come in with jobs, many times full-time jobs. So it's not a stereotypical lazy issue or something like that. No, it's working people who have children, but also have high costs and sometimes low wages. So we want to let you know what the families go through. So Erin Mathis with me here today. I thought I would interview her, and she was gracious enough to agree to it. So thanks, Erin, for being here. But Erin, a couple years ago, you had gone through our shelter. But before that, what happened to your family? And we'll end with some of the positives because she's made a ton of strides. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what happened to your family a few years back?
About like 3 years ago, we had got evicted due to my work. I lost my job, didn't have nobody to help with the kids, didn't have daycare. Tax time was right around the corner, but it wasn't coming fast enough. So I got evicted. I had to go to court. I talked to the lawyer in the apartment, and for my eviction to basically tell them like, hey, my tax money coming tomorrow, would I be able to either pay my late fees and stay here and just pay my rent, or be able to just stay here until I can get my tax money and be able to get the U-Haul. They told me no. The apartments told me no, and they told me I had to be out the next day about 5 o'clock.
Where did you wind up staying the next day?
Went to go stay with my kid's dad for a little while, left from there, wasn't working out. Went to go stay with my sister, left there because it wasn't really working out. I had 2 kids at that time, just found out I was pregnant, sleeping on floors and air mattresses. And sometimes, you know, that feeling as if you're not wanted, staying with other people, you know, and car breaking down, I ain't got no money, I'm not working, staying with my sisters.
Did it have any effect on your kids that you saw?
Man, it had an effect on my oldest when her attitude went from a bubbly kid to having a whole type of attitude, having a whole bunch of type of different attitudes.
Not anything that she had been doing before? It was
Nah, she was really cool before we had got evicted, and then when we had got evicted, man, her attitude went from 0 to 100 real quick.
Yeah, maybe from the stress. Yeah. And
yeah.
What about mail? If you were having to bounce around from kid's dad to sister, where was your mail forwarded to?
Oh, well, the mail that I did have, I would get it forwarded to my mom, and she would call me, tell me I got mail, and I would tell her to open up and read it to me. If it's important, keep it, and if it's not, throw it away.
Okay. Where'd your mom live?
My mom lives all the way in Plainfield.
In Plainfield. Okay. So if you wanted to get mail, either she or you would have to drive to the suburbs to get mail.
She was driving to me to bring it to me. I wouldn't drive out there.
Yeah, and you said your car had broken down anyway. Okay. So how'd you wind up getting back on your feet?
One morning, as I was at my sister's house, I was tired, over it. I picked up the phone and called Family Promises. Mike answered the phone. He told me to call 211.
We were full. We were full. I like Erin. She's great, but we were full. Okay. So how many times? But that's important. How many times do you think you had to call?
I probably only called like twice. But
Okay, that's a good reason.
the same day, he did tell me it was full, and then I had called back again, and he finally was like, they have an opening. And Veronica came and picked me and the kids up. And we was here for about 4 months, and I was pregnant.
Took a while. Did you have any challenges finding housing? Because my memory is you had a lot of different jobs and kept finding a better job. So you got on at McDonald's and then better, and then eventually, where did you get a job that you would like to stick with?
I went back to Walmart.
Okay.
Making $11.50 an hour.
Okay.
And Veronica went to houses, apartments to houses, just trying to find me somewhere for me and the kids. And everywhere turned me down because of my eviction.
They turned you down because of the eviction?
Yep.
Did they ever try to charge you anything extra? Because we've had families who have said, this landlord would charge me double the security deposit. So instead of saving up $750, I had to save up $1,500 plus first month's rent, so $2,250 just for a 2 or 3 bedroom. Did you experience anything like that or no? It's okay if not, I'm just curious.
When I moved into Newbridge, no, I don't recall. But when I moved into the apartment I got evicted from, yes. And then when they evicted me, they charged me $600 for a lawyer fee, and on top of other fees that I feel as if I shouldn't have to pay for.
That's important. So if you go into the public database on the internet, you can look up your eviction. Do you know how many you owed when you left the previous unit that you were evicted from?
I only owe one. I had an eviction previous, but I paid that off overnight. So I had already paid off my first eviction. So this will be my second eviction. And now I'm in a real $2,100 because of that eviction.
But initially it wasn't $2,100. It's gone down to that. What was it initially?
I want to say at least 25 to 30.
2,500 to 3,000.
Yeah.
And what made it? So you've been paying it off?
Yes, I'll pay $50 a week.
So if you owed 2,500, was that all the rent you owed and damages and other stuff like that?
No.
No.
I'm pretty sure they added on my damage fee. They added on a lawyer fee.
But I know this year damages were like $150.
Yes.
And your rent was like a month or month and a half. So what else was it?
Damage fees, lawyer fees, court fees.
How much was the court fee?
$600.
$600. Okay. So you had a debt. When you went and applied at other places, you had a debt that said you owe $2,500 and you're working it out with them. Did they ever try to garnish wages?
Yep.
For those on the webinar, if you're not familiar, garnishing wages means the landlord goes to court and gets a court order to take money out of your paycheck automatically. And it can be done for a lot of debts like eviction debts or child support or other stuff. So did they try to garnish wages?
They sure did. They tried to garnish wages while I was standing in the shelter. And they told me they were going to take $150 out of my check every month.
While making $11.50 an hour?
No, I was working at McDonald's then.
Oh,
I
that was before
only
Walmart.
making, $7.50, and they were trying to take $150 out. And then when I worked at McDonald's, that's when we made arrangements for $50 a week.
So they stopped the garnishment because you agreed to pay $50 a week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's what's brought it down to $2,100, but you'll be doing that $50 a week unless you get an amazing tax check or amazing promotion. You'll be doing that.
Tax time is gonna pay that off.
Yeah, but you'll be doing $50 a week for a long time. So, but you got housing. Tell us some things you're proudest of today about your kids or yourself. We don't want to focus on just the whore you went to kind of for that year, but tell us about today. What are you proud of?
I'm still in my apartment.
Almost 2 years now.
Almost 2 years.
Applause. Everybody clap on the webinar. We can't hear you. Unmute yourself. I'm just kidding.
I'm still, I'm at a better place than I was back then. Sure, my kids is happy. They still in daycare.
Has your daughter, has her behavior changed at all?
Her behavior's changed a little bit. She's 10, so if you got kids.
Now she's preteen. Yeah.
Yeah, if y'all got kids, I know how the preteen stuff goes.
Okay.
But she is getting better. My youngest one, her attitude is all bubbly. My attitude is better. I'm not as stressed. I have my days where I do be stressed, but then again, I just think about it like, hey, I could be back at Family Promises and, back in the shelter, but I'm not. I still got my place.
Okay.
Everything's going good.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing the story because I think that's important. There are evictions out there that might be fair. Even if they're legal, we can still ask whether they're fair or not. Laws aren't always fair. But whether fair or not, I think that's a good example of what a lot of families go through, bouncing around for weeks or sometimes months in tough conditions, and tough with mail, tough with kids acting out, tough with everything. So thank you for the bravery to share your story, and congratulations on getting back on your feet and paying your way the last couple of years, because you've been a testament. So back to you, Michaela, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you so much, Mike and Erin, for sharing and for being so candid. This has been a great webinar, and I hope everyone has been able to learn lots about eviction. We do have time for a few questions, and it is about 1:55, so a couple of panelists have agreed to stay on past 2, just a little past 2, if anyone has time to stay. I also want to, while we're answering questions, give you information about the next 2 webinars in the Evicted in Indiana series, as well as the reading guide for the book Evicted. And we will also drop links to both of these things in the chat so that you all can get signed up for both. The webinar series will just go deeper into eviction. The next time we'll talk about landlord-tenant relationships, and then after that, the health implications of eviction. And then the reading guide is kind of, a way to get even deeper into eviction. If you're interested in reading Matthew Desmond's Evicted book, this reading guide is really a way to, really kind of ask questions and read along with someone if you want, if you're just reading by yourself, or if you are reading in a group. And so yeah, we will drop those links. And now for questions. Okay, lots of questions. Let me see here. Okay, so this one is for Brandon. So this comes from someone who represents tenants pro bono. Is there a remedy where an eviction is filed and eventually harms the ability to obtain future housing? Have you taken action against larger property managers or landlords?
Oh, that's a great question. So, yes, as part of my role, I certainly look for systemic issues, and that does include if there's a problematic landlords who are filing a lot of frivolous or unsubstantiated eviction claims, and certainly our office is prepared to review and potentially engage in some affirmative litigation or proactive litigation to try to minimize or stop that. As far as on the eviction record, I can just kind of briefly speak on this, and this may be talked about broader in some of the future Evicted Indiana programs, but something that's been discussed among advocates for a long time is potentially a statutory way or a new court rule to find a way to seal evictions, sort of similar to like certain crimes and certain convictions can be expunged from individual records. I only one time in Indiana, there is, and the person who asked this question probably knows that, but in Indiana there's an administrative code, and under the administrative code there's a sealing of court records rule, and I've tried this for a number of cases and not been successful, but one time ever I was able to get a person's eviction records sealed because that client actually was a victim of domestic violence, and there was a lot of other factors that became public, and I made a public policy argument for that, why it should be off. So only once through the administrative code have I gotten one person's eviction record sealed.
Thank you so much, Brandon. So this next question is for Kelsey. How were the estimates of the 300,000 plus households that could be at risk for eviction compiled? Was it compiled based on the knowledge that jobs were lost during the pandemic?
I actually want to say that maybe that was a stat that Brandon mentioned. So,
oh, okay.
Brandon, I'm curious to hear.
Which was the stat? Sorry, say that stat again.
The 300,000 plus households that are at risk for eviction. How was it compiled?
I can send that out. I did not compile that. That is from, it was called a Stout Eviction Predictor. As people in this area know we get a lot of different groups and organizations tracking data. So this is one of the predictors that I thought seemed, based on how I looked at their county data. I am not a researcher. I want to be very clear. I am a lawyer, so I am research dumb. So I am happy if you want to email me, if you look at the slides, I can send you the link to that predictor that I use and run. So that was just done by a third party.
Okay, and one more question, I believe, for Brandon. Did late fees accrue under Indiana's moratorium?
Yes, under Indiana's moratorium, they did. Only under the CARES Act eviction moratorium, and again, only for that specified period of time were late fees related to rent waived.
Okay. Okay, question for Mike. Are there specific faith groups you know about who are offering rental assistance?
That's a great question. And although I could probably name you 10 congregations that will accept walk-ins, I don't have any of their permission right now to say that, yeah, they have a line item in their budget for emergency assistance, because as far as I know, it goes really, really quickly and they're overwhelmed, as is everybody else. So,
Right.
but I heard that Indiana Legal Services was trying to put that together. So I can talk to Brandon about that and at least see if they'll give permission to do that.
Okay. And another question for Brandon. What do you do if the landlord doesn't accept the rental assistance? Don't they have to agree to participate?
Yes. Oh, that's a good, it's a loaded question there. So yeah, yes, the landlords do have to agree to accept the rental assistance. I will save any editorializing on that. I will say, you know, I was trying to say this in a public forum. I will say this: if the landlord does not accept rental assistance, now the landlord may have some legitimate reasons for not doing so, and so I want to be fair. But if that ultimately results in a case of eviction against you or against the tenant, I would certainly raise that with the court and let the judge know that you took all the proactive steps you could possibly take to complete the contract and to complete the lease and to pay the rent. I would point out that it was the landlord's fault because they did not agree to take the rental assistance that you found, and that if the landlord had not denied, then the landlord would have been made whole. So I would make side of that policy argument. I certainly cannot guarantee that we'll win, and I certainly cannot, but I think there are some, I suspect some courts will accept that argument, but I would just make it clear and make a record. And if you unfortunately have to go to an eviction hearing, I would just bring documentation showing that, because I think that all of them, I've seen them you get a notification back from the program saying the landlord refused to participate. So I would just let a court know if unfortunately you get an eviction filing.
Okay. There's one question about what educational opportunities are available to help tenants understand leases and how to avoid a breach. And if there's a problem, what can they do to avoid or minimize damages? I can start by saying that Housing for Hoosiers actually has some resources there. I believe there's a tenants' rights sort of guide. And then if any other panelist has anything to add. Okay, and then last question, how are local policymakers responding to these stark statistics?
This is Mike. I'm happy to chime in, but not first. Does anybody else have?
I can go first, Mike. I can share an anecdote around, so a couple years ago, Bianca and I, through Chris, did some work on evictions and homelessness prevention. And we've done some other work looking at housing trends and eviction trends at the township level. And I do know of at least one, and actually now I think about it, two townships used kind of the research that we did and the stats that we compiled to meet internally within the township and identify, hey, this is a problem, and we as a township have a responsibility to figure out what we're going to do about that. I don't know like any specific policy changes that have come of this, but I did think that was like kind of a helpful anecdote, that the information is getting to policymakers, and I think local government officials are taking notice. I also, just based on what Bianca was saying before, just with the complex nature apart from COVID. So with the complex nature of like all the things that factor into why Indiana has such a terrible eviction crisis, it's going to be really hard for a single policy or a single entity to sort of legislate or make policies our way out of this problem. It has to be a concerted effort between multiple levels of government, multiple different fields. And so that is what makes it complicated, is that it is going to require collaboration across multiple levels.
I can quickly chime in specifically to, I will say the Mayor Hogsett and the administration at the City of Indianapolis have, took this very seriously on, especially after his reelection. So in February, two initiatives that are the first in the state of Indiana, I shouldn't say initiatives now, they are city ordinances and part of the city code. There's an anti-retaliation ordinance as well as a renter's rights ordinance that the city passed here in Indianapolis that I know other cities are very eager to see and possibly replicate, specifically up in Fort Wayne. And as well, I've been consulting with folks in the city council in Evansville to maybe do what Indianapolis has done. So far, or for that, I guess to say that the city of Indianapolis has responded.
This is Mike. I had the privilege of getting a call from the city around last February because the same night that the city county council in Indy was trying to pass some tenant protections locally, the state house was entertaining an amendment to the bill to prevent the city preemptively from doing that. So it's kind of been a tale of different sized jurisdictions. Municipalities have been responsive. The state house has been largely not responsive, in my opinion. And the gatekeeper that we need to advocate to is Jerry Torr. Representative Torr from Carmel sits, at least for a bill that we were trying to get through that we had given input on to Representative Shackelford last January. He is the head of the House Judiciary Committee, and Representative Torr said there was no time in the session to give it a hearing because it was a short session. And then when the Indiana Apartment Association drafted an amendment to a bill of Representative Victoria Sparks, actually Senator, he gave that immediate consideration with almost no day's notice for testimony. So we ran down there and testified. But luckily, the governor had vetoed that amendment, so the city could actually pass what it was trying to pass. So in other words, the Judiciary Committee on the Senate and the House has to be the place that landlord tenant bills get sent to try to revise and reform the landlord tenant law in the state of Indiana. And so those chairs, like Representative Jerry Torr, are the key people to advocate to give these bills hearings, or else they'll never get to the floor. And so far, I think for years, the bills that have tried to increase tenant protections have been DOA and never gotten even a hearing. Sorry for being a little candid, but have to.
That is okay. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you to all of the panelists and all of the attendees for attending today. Again, you can go to Housing for Hoosiers to sign up for the next two webinars in the series, as well as grab that reading guide for Matthew Desmond's Evicted. And if anyone has any other questions or needs anything else, please feel free to email me at njames@prosperityindiana.org. Thank you so much. You'll have a great rest of your day.